Chicago's Morning Answer continues next. In our 1 hour heating and air conditioning weather center, a chilly day ahead, sun and clouds and a high near 50. Currently 39. Next news at 7, breaking news as it happens. Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan and Amy continues next on AM 560, The Answer.
This hourly segment is brought to you by the Alpha Wealth Group, bringing the trilogy of estate, tax, and investment planning together. Visit alphawealthgroup.com for a free report.
Let freedom ring this afternoon at 2 with Sean Hannity on AM 560, The Answer.
Good morning, Dan and Amy. Lots to talk about with Dr. John Lee, so let's get right to him. Dr. John Lee, retired professor of pathology and NHS, National Health Service consultant, pathologist across the pond there in the UK. Dr. Lee, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Good morning.
Morning. You had an interesting piece in spectator.us about the evolutionary nature of the virus and viruses generally. And this against the backdrop of the news last week that 66% of new hospital admissions in New York City were people who had been infected while in close quarters, while locked down. And you suggest that it's perhaps the case that the lockdown is frustrating an evolutionary tendency of the virus to get weaker over time. Please explain.
Yeah, well, it's a hypothesis, but it's the sort of thing that we see in other viral epidemics. The idea is that if you any of these viruses they're not just one type of thing. They're millions and billions of particles which are slightly different between them. And these RNA viruses, which are the sort that coronaviruses, are more susceptible to being different than many other types of virus because of their the way they replicate themselves. So the idea is if there's differences between the viruses in terms of how nasty they are when they affect you, if you have a particularly nasty version and you take to your bed, you'll tend to automatically socially isolate yourself because that's what you do when you're ill. But if you have a mild version that doesn't make you too ill, you'll tend to carry on going out and going shopping and seeing friends and going to work and so forth. So you'll tend to spread that milder version more widely than the nastier version will be spread. And so quite quickly in the population, the idea is that the milder versions will come to predominate and we'll all have a mild version of the virus and it won't be too bad. So that's a hypothesis, but it's like I say, it's pretty well borne out by what we already know about viruses. So on that basis, asymptomatic people spreading mild versions of the virus would be a good thing because it just means we build up antibodies to a mild version. Whereas, keeping us all locked down and not letting the mild version spread might actually keep the virus a bit nastier for a bit longer. That's the general idea.
I wanted to also get your take on some recent development, and this also out of New York City. The response, the immune response in some children, that this rash that they're getting, and the idea that maybe in kids who are we've otherwise noted are virtually invulnerable to the virus if they don't have an underlying condition, that that in some children maybe their immune response is sort of overproducing a response, and that's what's making them sick.
Yeah, I mean, as I understand it, correct me if I'm wrong, but as I understand it, that particular reaction to the virus is really pretty rare. It's just a handful of cases.
Right.
And I think it's true to say pretty much with any pathogen, that you get. A good example, for example, would be meningitis. Most people, when they are exposed to meningitis, have a pretty mild reaction to it, but a few people have a really horrible reaction to it, and these are the students, who sometimes found in their rooms very ill or even having died because they get an overwhelming reaction to that particular pathogen. So it can happen with a whole variety of different pathogens, and it's just one of the ways in which the body's immune response, as in anything complicated in nature, isn't 100% effective. Sometimes it overdoes it, and then that can cause you to get a reaction. As I understand it, that isn't a particularly common, or in fact a pretty rare thing with this virus, but it may be happening in a few cases. It wouldn't surprise me.
Yeah, and it sounded like it's Kawasaki disease, and that they have, antibodies. One kid had an antibody build up from COVID-19. He recovered, but the 3 who died did not. So it could be, I don't know. You wrote an article about 10 reasons to end.
Mechanism, I think.
Yeah, you wrote an article about 10 reasons to end the lockdown now. What's the number one reason we should end the lockdown now?
Okay, well, the number one reason, I think, is that the virus isn't as bad as we thought it was. I mean, it's usually the case in a viral epidemic, and particularly with a new virus, that you get a thing called ascertainment bias. So, in other words, the cases that you first become aware of are the really nasty ones that are in hospital in ITUs and causing really serious illness in those patients. And obviously, this virus can do that. It can be a nasty virus. It can cause bad illness in people. But the thing is, the real question is, what proportion of people does that do it in? And originally, because they were the only people we'd spotted, it seemed like quite a high proportion. But as this epidemic has gone on, the proportion, as we measure the percentages, these have been going down, and it seems that a large proportion of patients actually have asymptomatic disease with this virus. Only a relatively small proportion have a very serious illness. So the main reason for the lockdown was to try and stop the spread of a really serious illness. So apart from the fact that it may be having a perverse effect on making the illness stay more serious, the actual illness isn't as serious as we thought it was. And actually, when you look at the effects of the lockdown itself, when you look at the direct harms from the lockdown, these, at least in the UK, I mean, so the numbers we've got in the UK in terms of excess deaths, there are about 25,000 excess deaths, which is in the same ballpark as 5 or 6 other years in the last 25 years, so not that extraordinary. But over half of those deaths are not due to COVID. So they seem to be a direct result of the actual lockdown itself, which means that the lockdown is not neutral. It's having damaging effects on people, and we have to weigh up the harms of the virus and the harms of the lockdown itself.
With respect to the lockdown having damaging effects on people, health-wise, the fabulous Bakersfield boys, as I call them, these 2 emergency room doctors from California whose videos have gone viral as they've been offering their opinions about the virus as well as the response. One of the things they said that's been challenged that I wanted to get your professional opinion on is the idea that if you lock people down for an extended period of time, you're actually weakening their immune system because they're not going through the normal process of dealing with contagions and having the body fight off the contagions in the normal course of daily life. And so you come out of lockdown in a weaker state, immunologically speaking. Is that true?
Well, I doubt we've actually got any direct evidence for that, but it makes sense, doesn't it? I mean, if lockdown is having any effect on stopping this virus spreading, which is another point that we can debate potentially, but if it's really having an effect on stopping it spreading, it'll presumably also be having effects on other viruses that are out there, cold viruses and flu viruses and other things that are normally circulating around, so that when we do come out of lockdown, those things are going to have a bit of a resurgence as well. I think in terms of our immune system, I mean, there are so many antigens and bits and pieces in the air and in our environment. I personally would reserve judgment on whether that's a significant effect. I mean, our immune systems have been designed over millions of years to keep us healthy in the world, and the world is full of lots and lots of tiny particles which we breathe in and take in around us. So I don't know how significant an effect that would be. I think it's plausible that there'll be a resurgence in other communicable diseases when we come out of lockdown there.
One of the other points that you make in terms of arguing against ending the lockdown, or arguing for ending the lockdown, I should say, is that the way data is being used and reported, it's like the old saying, data is being used like a drunk uses a lamppost for support rather than illumination. And this is what you're describing is data presented without context that not only doesn't tell you what you need to know, could indicate the opposite of what you think is of what we know to be true.
Yeah, I think that's really true. I mean, the trouble with it is, isn't it, is that if you present a death number, the number of people who apparently died of this disease, that's a big number and it makes a very dramatic headline. But in a way, what we're having at the moment, it seems to me, is not just an epidemic of this virus, but we're having an epidemic of awareness, an epidemic of awareness that these things are out there, that they do kill people. When you look at the flu numbers, for example, on many years, they also make huge numbers, but because we're so used to the idea of flu, those don't get presented in the same way. The trouble with it is, if you present raw death numbers, they look very dramatic. It sounds like some awful plane crash or train crash or something going on. But when you look at them in the context of the number of people who are dying normally, of the number of people who normally die of viral infections, of the sorts of people who are dying of these viral infections, as opposed to fit and healthy people, say, you get a whole different picture. And I think what you just said is quite right, that the numbers themselves can be used to inform a narrative which is is either not the whole truth or even actually not the truth at all in terms of what we're seeing with this particular disease.
Well, Doctor, I mean, is lockdown even sustainable? I mean, how long could people live like this?
Yeah, well, I don't think so. I mean, I think lockdown is a bit of a crazy response, really. I mean, I've heard it discussed whether or not we would have ever gone into lockdown if this virus hadn't originally been found in China. You know, China had a particular response to lockdown, and it seems extraordinary to me that Western democracies have copied that sort of totalitarian model of dealing with the disease. I mean, I think it was understandable that we could have gone into lockdown initially because the pictures were so awful and people were very frightened this was a bad disease. But in the same way that we changed our policy from what we were doing before to going into lockdown, I think it's perfectly reasonable now to change the policy from lockdown to a much looser type of way of dealing with this virus, in which the vast majority of people of working age, for example, who are fit and healthy, won't get this virus badly. So they should be out going to work. We should all be doing what we're normally doing. I think people who are worried about the virus or potentially vulnerable to the virus, they could potentially self-isolate, and I think people with symptoms could self-isolate. And it seems to me that when you take the whole picture of the virus plus the effects of lockdown, that moving back to that less restrictive model of trying to deal with this virus would be just as effective in dealing with the virus and also massively less harmful in terms of dealing with all the other effects that are being caused by lockdown.
Let's talk about what else we understand to be true, because this relates to lockdown policies. The transmission of the virus. You have people you see walking down the street. One person has a mask on, the other doesn't. The one with the mask on sees the other person without the mask, dives into a bush lest they be immediately infected by just walking past someone. I mean, it's lunacy, but it's also real. It's real conduct among some subset of the population. Yeah. And we there was a study a few weeks ago we mentioned on this show out of Hong Kong, I believe, that suggests there was almost no incidence of transmission outside. And yet you have rules. I'll just use this as an example because it's particularly poignant to me. In Illinois, you can play golf, but only 2 people and no carts. In Michigan, you can play golf 4 people, but you have to take an individual cart. In Chicago, you can't play golf at all, even within Illinois. Chicago, you can't play golf on Chicago golf courses. You can in Illinois. That's stricter. Michigan, right next door, has this strict. Does any of that have any basis in science? And what do we know about the likelihood of transmission outdoors for golf and every other outdoor activity?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we're seeing with these types of things is what happens when people are frightened and when we don't really have data to support one thing over another thing. I don't think there's virtually no direct evidence really on how this particular virus or even really viruses in general are transmitted. I mean, network science looks at makes modelling assumptions about how viruses spread in populations, and they set up models and they try and see how well their models match what's happening in a population. But of course, in a mathematical modelling type of scenario, there are literally thousands and tens of thousands of different ways that you can mix up your variables and things to make the output that you want to see, and then you can claim that this or that or the other has an influence on it. But in terms of social distancing, do we know whether this virus is spread by, for example, hugging somebody or sitting next to them on the couch, or whether it's when you walk through air that they've just breathed a few minutes ago because the virus particles are in the air? Which way can you catch the virus? Is it all of those ways? Is it only the first 2? What is it? I don't think we know. But what it does seem to me is that a lot of the things that are being suggested about social distancing simply aren't the way that human beings live their lives. And I think we have to have a balance between what we think is reasonable behavior in terms of living our lives and what the risks of that behavior are in terms of catching illnesses and diseases and viruses. Now, if this virus was as awful as it was originally presented to be, and that was actually 3.4% of people who caught it were going to die. But imagine in London, say, in the 16th century, and the plague was there. 1 in 3 or 1 in 2 people who caught the plague died. If it was as bad as that, well, it might be sensible to dive into a bush to avoid the person walking past you. But on the other hand, if it now seems likely that 99.9% of people who get this virus, whether they're fit or not, will survive it, it doesn't seem to me, at least, that doesn't seem to me to be a proportionate response. So I think it's just a question of balance. And, if we try and look at this without being emotional about it, without being frightened about it, without being swayed just by the raw death numbers, and look at actually what's happening in terms of people who catch this virus, and then what we actually know about how this virus is transmitted, I think there's very little evidence to suggest we should be doing any of the social distancing measures that are there. I think we should be aiming to get back to normal pretty quickly, and I think as we get back to normal, we will find that not a lot happens really, and maybe there'll be a few more cases. But the justification for lockdown in social distancing was never that these were going to be reduced on a 5-year view anyway. The virus is out there. Pandora's box is open. It's not going to go away. So we will be living with it. So we might as well get used to it, seems to me.
I wanted to ask you one question about vaccines, too. The news out over the weekend that the World Health Organization released guidance on how an approach to variolation could be ethically justified. I mean, this is not a new idea. It was done to George Washington's troops at Valley Forge, for goodness sakes. Mm-hmm. But there's obviously a lot of questions about it. We have a different culture now than we did previously when variolation was used for other diseases like malaria and typhoid and the flu. What is your take on, to describe it for the layman out there, which is me too until this, the purposeful infection, low doses of the virus properly monitored by medical professionals for the purpose of generating the antibodies and a vaccine?
Yeah, well, I mean, the classic example of this was years ago with William Jenner with smallpox, wasn't it? And smallpox was a horrible disease that killed, untold thousands of people. And they discovered that the milking maids who caught a variola, which was a virus related to smallpox, but much less mild, called cowpox, they caught that when they were milking the cows, and they never got smallpox. So then it was realized that the antibodies that you made to the cowpox virus would also protect you from smallpox. So then the idea was that they took bits of the pus from cowpox people and they put it into other people, and that protected them from the smallpox. So the idea is if you can find a virus that's closely related to the virus that you're worried about, but not as nasty, that you can deliberately infect people with that to protect them from the nasty one. So obviously that begs the question of how nasty this virus is in the first place. As I say, the evidence is that it's much less nasty than was originally thought. And it does seem to me that a lot of the narrative about this virus is sort of lagging behind the reality of what's happening on the ground. So people's initial fears and the pictures that came out of New York, and Wuhan and Italy, they framed people's initial fears and made people worried that this virus was a really awful virus. I'm not saying it isn't a nasty virus, it clearly is, but it's not as bad as we originally thought. So whether it's necessary to try and do that, or whether, in fact, actually just getting back to more normal life and letting it spread through the population as it's going to spread is the right approach, seems to me that's a moot point at the moment. And also whether or not we actually have versions of this virus that are milder. But for the sake of argument, if the hypothesis we were talking about earlier about the mutation of this virus is true, then many people who've got the virus but asymptomatically may well have a very mild version of it. That might be a basis, if you could somehow isolate it, for infecting other people with. But one of the things about variolation was, so basically it's a question of whether you can actually find the source of virus that's a milder version of the virus. And whether by the time that becomes available, it'll even be worthwhile doing it, because it may well be that a lot of us have already had it by then.
He is Dr. John Lee, a retired professor of pathology and National Health Service consultant pathologist across the pond in the UK. Dr. Lee, thanks again for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thanks very much.
Love your insight. And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
Listen to Dan and Amy on your smartphone. Download the AM560 mobile app today at 560theanswer.com/mobile.
The Lou Dobbs Financial Report is brought to you by Signature Bank, helping local businesses succeed. Visit signaturebank.bank for your commercial banking needs.
I'm Lou Dobbs. The U.S. approves at-home saliva-based virus testing, and this week's economic reports ahead. Those stories next.
The stock market is tanking. Unemployment will likely reach an all-time high. Experts are saying the worst is yet to come, but what we need now is a solution. We have Colin Plume, president of Noble Gold, for some advice.